Hello there, how are you? Yareli Crafts and Mel Fly, you were 1 and 2 again. And I was sitting there wondering, I wonder whether they know each other. I wonder, or whether you are, both at other ends of the world. It is a very strange thing that I've mentioned before, how we're able to do this. And what I like to think of is that this is sort of just the way they used to read books in the old days when they would sit in front of the fire. But beautifully now, I can do it for you wherever you are. And that means that I might be reaching living rooms all over the world, which is very exciting. I certainly have had some people call from right back from different countries saying that they use this to learn English or that they're away from home at the moment and it gives them some consolation and companionship in English, and I love that. I'm very, very happy to be doing this. My name is Gildart, and I've been reading Fireside Readings for a while now, and we are in the middle of The Awakening by Chopin. And where we are at right now is that Edna has decided to move. Her husband, Mr. Pontellier, is away, and she just suddenly decided that she was going to move. And there's a little house very close to their bigger house that she's already moving into. She's going to have a dinner party and invite all her friends to the dinner party as a sort of going away party. She wrote to her husband to tell him that she was going to do this, and he hasn't yet responded. But we are just about to have the goodbye dinner. So, welcome to a fireside reading of The Awakening by Chopin. Chapter 28. Edna cried a little that night after Arobin left her. It was only one phase of the multitudinous emotions which had assailed her. There was with her an overwhelming feeling of irresponsibility. There was the shock of the unexpected and the unaccustomed. There was her husband's reproach looking at her from the external things around her, which he had provided for her external existence. There was Robert's reproach, making itself felt by a quicker, fiercer, more overpowering love, which had awakened within her toward him. Above all, there was understanding. She felt as if a mist had been lifted from her eyes, enabling her to look upon and comprehend the significance of life, that monster made up of beauty and brutality. But among the conflicting sensations which assailed her, there was neither shame nor remorse. There was a dull pang of regret, because it was not the kiss of love which had inflamed her, because it was not love which had held this cup of life to her lips. Chapter 29. Without even waiting for an answer from her husband regarding his opinion or wishes in the matter, Edna hastened her preparations for quitting her home on Esplanade Street and moving into the little house around the block. A feverish anxiety attended her every action in that direction. There was no moment of deliberation, no interval of repose between the thought and its fulfillment. Early upon the morning following those hours passed in Arobin's society, Edna set about securing her new abode and hurrying her arrangements for occupying it. Within the precincts of her home, she felt like one who has entered and lingered within the portals of some forbidden temple in which 1,000 muffled voices bade her be gone. Whatever was her own in the house, everything which she had acquired aside from her husband's bounty, she caused to be transported to the other house, supplying simple and meagre deficiencies from her own resources. Arobin found her with rolled sleeves, working in company with the housemaid when he looked in during the afternoon. She was splendid and robust, and had never appeared handsomer than in the old blue gown, with a red silk handkerchief knotted at random around her head to protect her hair from the dust. She was mounted upon a high step-ladder, unhooking a picture from the wall when he entered. He had found the front door open and had followed his ring by walking in unceremoniously. "Come down," he said. "Do you want to kill yourself?" She greeted him with affected carelessness and appeared absorbed in her occupation. If he had expected to find her languishing, reproachful, or indulging in sentimental tears, he must have been greatly surprised. He was, no doubt, prepared for any emergency, ready for any one of the foregoing attitudes, just as he bent himself easily and naturally to the situation which confronted him. "Please, come down," he insisted, holding the ladder and looking up at her. "No," she answered. "Ellen is afraid to mount the ladder. Joe is working over at the pigeon house. That's the name Ellen gives it because it's so small and looks like a pigeon house. And someone has to do this." Arobin pulled off his coat and expressed himself ready and willing to tempt fate in her place. Ellen brought him one of her dust caps and went into contortions of mirth, which she found it impossible to control when she saw him put it on before the mirror as grotesquely as he could. Edna herself could not refrain from smiling when she fastened it at his request. So it was he who, in turn, mounted the ladder, unhooking pictures and curtains and dislodging ornaments as Edna directed. When he had finished, he took off his dust cap and went out to wash his hands. Edna was sitting on the tabouret, idly brushing the tips of a feather duster along the carpet when he came in again. "Is there anything more you will let me do?" he asked. "That is all," she answered. "Ellen can manage the rest." She kept the young woman occupied in the drawing room, unwilling to be left alone with Arobin. "What about the dinner?" he said. "The grand event, the coup d'etat." "It will be day after tomorrow. Why do you call it the coup d'etat?" "Oh, it will be very fine, all my best of everything. Crystal, silver, and gold, Sèvres, flowers, music, and champagne to swim in. I'll let Léonce pay the bills. I wonder what he'll say when he sees the bills." "And you ask me why I call it a coup d'etat." Arobin had put on his coat, and he stood before her and asked if his cravat was plum. She told him it was, looking no higher than the tip of his collar. "When do you go to the pigeon house?" with all due acknowledgment to Ellen. "Day after tomorrow, after the dinner. I shall sleep there." "Ellen, would you very kindly get me a glass of water?" asked Arobin. "The dust in the curtains, if you will pardon me for hinting such a thing, has parched my throat to a crisp." "While Ellen gets the water," said Edna, rising, "I will say goodbye and let you go. I must get rid of this grime, and I have a million things to do and think of." "When shall I see you?" asked Arobin, seeking to detain her, the maid having left the room. At the dinner, of course. You are invited. Not before, not tonight, or tomorrow morning, or tomorrow noon, or night, or the day after morning, or noon. Can't you see yourself without my telling you what an eternity it is? He had followed her into the hall and to the foot of the stairway, looking up at her as she mounted with her face half turned to him. Not an instant sooner, she said, but she laughed and looked at him with eyes that at once gave him courage to wait and made it torture to wait. Chapter 30. Though Edna had spoken of the dinner as a very grand affair, it was in truth a very small affair and very select, insomuch as the guests invited were few and were selected with discrimination. She had counted upon an even dozen seating themselves at her round mahogany board, forgetting for the moment that Madame Ratignolle was to the last degree souffrante and unpresentable, and not foreseeing that Madame Lebrun would send 1,000 regrets at the last moment. So there were only 10 after all, which made a cosy, comfortable number. There were Mr. and Mrs. Merriman, a pretty, vivacious little woman in the 30s, her husband, a jovial fellow, something of a shallow pate, who laughed a good deal at other people's witticisms, and had thereby made himself extremely popular. Mrs. Highcamp had accompanied them. Of course, there was Alcée Arobin, and Mademoiselle Reisz had consented to come. Edna had sent her a fresh bunch of violets with black lace trimmings for her hair. Monsieur Ratignolle brought himself and his wife's excuses. Victor Lebrun, who happened to be in the city, bent upon relaxation, had accepted with alacrity. There was a Miss Mayblunt, no longer in her teens, who looked at the world through lorgnettes and with the keenest interest. It was thought and said that she was an intellectual. It was suspected of her that she wrote under a nom de guerre. She had come with a gentleman by the name of Gouvernail, connected with one of the daily papers, of whom nothing special could be said, except that he was observant and seemed quiet and inoffensive. Edna herself made the 10th, and at 8:30 they seated themselves at table, Arobin and Monsieur Ratignolle on either side of their hostess. Mrs. Highcamp sat between Arobin and Victor Lebrun. Then came Mrs. Merriman, Mr. Gouvernail, Miss Mayblunt, Mr. Merriman, and Mademoiselle Reisz, next to Monsieur Ratignolle. There was something extremely gorgeous about the appearance of the table, an effect of splendor conveyed by a cover of pale yellow satin under strips of lacework. There were wax candles in massive brass candelabra burning softly under yellow silk shades. Full, fragrant roses, yellow and red, abounded. There were silver and gold, as she had said there would be, and crystal, which glittered like the gems which the women wore. The ordinary stiff dining chairs had been discarded for the occasion and replaced by the most commodious and luxurious which could be collected throughout the house. Mademoiselle Reisz, being exceedingly diminutive, was elevated upon cushions, as small children are sometimes hoisted at table upon bulky volumes. "Something new, Edna?" exclaimed Miss Mayblunt, with lorgnette directed toward a magnificent cluster of diamonds that sparkled, that almost sputtered in Edna's hair, just over the center of her forehead. "Quite new, brand new, in fact, a present from my husband. It arrived this morning from New York. I may as well admit that this is my birthday and that I am 29. In good time, I expect you to drink my health. Meanwhile, I shall ask you to begin with this cocktail composed, would you say composed, with an appeal to, would you say composed, with an appeal to Miss Mayblunt, composed by my father in honor of Sister Janet's wedding. Before each guest stood a tiny glass that looked and sparkled like a garnet gem. Then, all things considered, spoke Arobin, it might not be amiss to start out by drinking the Colonel's health in the cocktail which he composed on the birthday of the most charming of women, the daughter whom he invented. Mr. Merriman's laugh at this sally was such a genuine outburst and so contagious that it started the dinner with an agreeable swing that never slackened. Miss Mayblunt begged to be allowed to keep her cocktail untouched before her, just to look at it. The color was marvelous. She could compare it to nothing she had ever seen, and the garnet lights which it emitted were unspeakably rare. She pronounced the Colonel an artist, and stuck to it. Monsieur Ratignolles was prepared to take things seriously. The mets, the entremets, the service, the decorations, even the people. He looked up from his pompano and inquired of Arobin if he were related to the gentleman of that name who formed one of the firm of Leitner and Arobin lawyers. The young man admitted that Leitner was a warm personal friend who permitted Arobin's name to decorate the firm's letterheads and to appear upon a shingle that graced Perdido Street. There are so many inquisitive people and institutions abounding, said Arobin, that one is really forced, as a matter of convenience these days, to assume the virtue of an occupation if he has it not. Monsieur Ratignolles stared a little and turned to ask Mademoiselle Reisz if she considered the symphony concerts to be up to a standard which had been set the previous winter. Mademoiselle Reisz answered Monsieur Ratignolles in French, which Edna thought a little rude under the circumstances, but characteristic. Mademoiselle had only disagreeable things to say of the symphony concerts, and insulting remarks to make of all the musicians of New Orleans, singly and collectively. All her interests seemed to be centered upon the delicacies placed before her. Mr. Merriman said that Mr. Arobin's remark about inquisitive people reminded him of a man from Waco the other day at the St. Charles Hotel. But as Mr. Merriman's stories were always lame and lacking point, his wife seldom permitted him to complete them. She interrupted him to ask if he remembered the name of the author whose book she had bought the week before to send to a friend in Geneva. She was talking books with Mr. Gouvernail and trying to draw from him his opinion upon current literary topics. Her husband told the story of the Waco man privately to Miss Mayblunt, who pretended to be greatly amused and to think it extremely clever. Mrs. Highcamp hung with languid but unaffected interest upon the warm and impetuous volubility of her left-hand neighbor, Victor Lebrun. Her attention was never for a moment withdrawn from him after seating herself at table, and when he turned to Mrs. Merriman, who was prettier and more vivacious than Mrs. Highcamp, she waited with easy indifference for an opportunity to reclaim his attention. There was the occasional sound of music, of mandolins sufficiently removed to be an agreeable accompaniment rather than an interruption to the conversation. Outside, the soft, monotonous splash of a fountain could be heard. The sound penetrated into the room with the heavy odor of jessamine that came through the open windows. The golden shimmer of Edna's satin gown spread in rich folds on either side of her. There was a soft fall of lace encircling her shoulders. It was the color of her skin, without the glow, the myriad living tints that one may sometimes discover in vibrant flesh. There was something in her attitude, in her whole appearance, when she leaned her head against the high-backed chair and spread her arms, which suggested the regal woman, the one who rules, who looks on, who stands alone. But as she sat there amid her guests, she felt the old ennui overtaking her, the hopelessness which so often assailed her, which came upon her like an obsession, like something extraneous, independent of volition. It was something which announced itself, a chill breath that seemed to issue from some vast cavern wherein discords waited. There came over her the acute longing which always summoned into her spiritual vision the presence of the beloved one, overpowering her at once with a sense of the unattainable. The moments glided on, while a feeling of good fellowship passed around the circle like a mystic cord, holding and binding these people together with jest and laughter. Monsieur Ratignolle was the first to break the pleasant charm. At 10 o'clock he excused himself. Madame Ratignolle was waiting for him at home. She was bien souffrante, and she was filled with vague dread which only her husband's presence could allay. Mademoiselle Reisz arose with Monsieur Ratignolle, who offered to escort her to the car. She had eaten well, she had tasted the good rich wines, and they must have turned her head, for she bowed pleasantly to all as she withdrew from table. She kissed Edna upon the shoulder and whispered, "Bonne nuit, ma reine. Soyez sage." She had been a little bewildered upon rising, or rather descending from her cushions, and Monsieur Ratignolle gallantly took her arm and led her away. Mrs. Highcamp was weaving a garland of roses, yellow and red. When she had finished the garland, she laid it lightly upon Victor's black curls. He was reclining far back in the luxurious chair, holding a glass of champagne to the light, as if a magician's wand had touched him. The garland of roses transformed him into a vision of oriental beauty. His cheeks were the color of crushed grapes, and his dusky eyes glowed with a languishing fire. "Sapristi!" exclaimed Arobin. But Mrs. Highcamp had one more touch to add to the picture. She took from the back of her chair a white silken scarf, with which she had covered her shoulders in the early part of the evening. She draped it across the boy in graceful folds and in a way to conceal his black, conventional evening dress. He did not seem to mind what she did to him, only smiled, showing a faint gleam of white teeth, while he continued to gaze with narrowing eyes at the light through his glass of champagne. "Oh, to be able to paint in color rather than in words," exclaimed Miss Mayblunt, losing herself in a rhapsodic dream as she looked at him. "There was a graven image of desire painted with red blood on a ground of gold," murmured Gouvernail under his breath. The effect of the wine upon Victor was to change his accustomed volubility into silence. He seemed to have abandoned himself to a reverie and to be seeing pleasing visions in the amber bead. "Sing," entreated Mrs. Highcamp. "Won't you sing to us?" "Let him alone," said Arobin. "He's posing," offered Mr. Merriman. "Let him have it out." "I believe he's paralyzed," laughed Mrs. Merriman, and leaning over the youth's chair, she took the glass from his hand and held it to his lips. He sipped the wine slowly, and when he had drained the glass, she laid it upon the table and wiped his lips with her little filmy handkerchief. "Yes, I'll sing for you," he said, turning in his chair toward Mrs. Highcamp. He clasped his hands behind his head and, looking up at the ceiling, began to hum a little, trying his voice like a musician tuning an instrument. Then, looking at Edna, he began to sing, "Ah, si tu savais." "Stop!" she cried. "Don't sing that. I don't want you to sing it." And she laid her glass so impetuously and blindly upon the table as to shatter it against a carafe. The wine spilled over Arobin's legs, and some of it trickled down upon Mrs. Highcamp's black gauze gown. Victor had lost all idea of courtesy, or else he thought his hostess was not in earnest, for he laughed and went on, "Ah, si tu savais ce que tes yeux me disent." "Oh, you mustn't," exclaimed Edna, and pushing back her chair, she got up and, going behind him, placed her hand over his mouth. He kissed the soft palm that pressed upon his lips. No, I won't, Mrs. Pontellier. I didn't know you meant it," looking up at her with caressing eyes. The touch of his lips was like a pleasing sting to her hand. She lifted the garland of roses from his head and flung it across the room. "Come, Victor, you've posed long enough. Give Mrs. Highcamp her scarf." Mrs. Highcamp undraped the scarf from about him with her own hands. Miss Mayblunt and Mr. Gouvernail suddenly conceived the notion that it was time to say good night, and Mr. and Mrs. Merriman wondered how it could be so late. Before parting from Victor, Mrs. Highcamp invited him to call upon her daughter, who she knew would be charmed to meet him and talk French and sing French songs with him. Victor expressed his desire and intention to call upon Miss Highcamp at the first opportunity which presented itself. He asked if Arobin were going his way. Arobin was not. The mandolin players had long since stolen away. A profound stillness had fallen upon the broad, beautiful streets. The voices of Edna's disbanding guests jarred like a discordant note upon the quiet harmony of the night. Chapter 31. "Well?" questioned Arobin, who had remained with Edna after the others had departed. "Well," she reiterated and stood up, stretching her arms and feeling the need to relax her muscles after having been so long seated. "What next?" he asked. "The servants are all gone. They left when the musicians did. I have dismissed them. The house has to be closed and locked. I shall trot around to the pigeon house and shall send Celestine over in the morning to straighten things up." He looked around and began to turn out some of the lights. "What about upstairs?" he inquired. I think it is all right, but there may be a window or two unlatched. We had better look. You might take a candle and see. And bring me my wrap and hat on the foot of the bed in the middle room. He went up with the light, and Edna began closing doors and windows. She hated to shut in the smoke and the fumes of the wine. Arobin found her cape and hat, which he brought down and helped her to put on. When everything was secured and the lights put out, they left through the front door, Arobin locking it and taking the key, which he carried for Edna. He helped her down the steps. Will you have a spray of jessamine? He asked, breaking off a few blossoms as he passed. No, I don't want anything. She seemed disheartened and had nothing to say. She took his arm, which he offered her, holding up the weight of her satin train with the other hand. She looked down, noticing the black line of his leg moving in and out, so close to her against the yellow shimmer of her gown. There was the whistle of a railway train somewhere in the distance, and the midnight bells were ringing. They met no one in their short walk. The pigeon house stood behind a locked gate and a shallow parterre that had been somewhat neglected. There was a small front porch upon which a long window and the front door opened. The door opened directly into the parlor. There was no side entry. Back in the yard was a room for servants in which old Celestine had been ensconced. Edna had left a lamp burning low upon the table. She had succeeded in making the room look habitable and homelike. There were some books on the table and a lounge near at hand. On the floor was a fresh matting covered with a rug or two, and on the walls hung a few tasteful pictures. But the room was filled with flowers. These were a surprise to her. Arobin had sent them and had had Celestine distribute them during Edna's absence. Her bedroom was adjoining, and across a small passage were the dining room and kitchen. Edna seated herself with every appearance of discomfort. Are you tired? He asked. Yes, and chilled and miserable. I feel as if I had been wound up to a certain pitch, too tight, and something inside of me had snapped. She rested her head against the table upon his bare arm. You want to rest, he said, and to be quiet. I'll go. I'll leave you and let you rest. Yes, she replied. He stood up beside her and smoothed her hair with his soft, magnetic hand. His touch conveyed to her a certain physical comfort. She could have fallen quietly asleep there if he had continued to pass his hand over her hair. He brushed the hair upward from the nape of her neck. I hope you will feel better and happier in the morning, he said. You have tried to do too much in the past few days, and dinner was the last straw. You might have dispensed with it. Yes, she admitted. It was stupid. No, it was delightful, but it has worn you out. His hand strayed to her beautiful shoulders, and he could feel the response of her flesh to his touch. He seated himself beside her and kissed her lightly on the shoulder. I thought you were going away, she said in an uneven voice. I am, after I have said good night. Good night, she murmured. He did not answer, except to continue to caress her. He did not say good night until she had become supple to his gentle, seductive entreaties. Thank you for joining me. I very much look forward to seeing you next time, tomorrow, 5 Pacific, at Fireside Reading. And if you'd like to check out any of the other stuff that I've done, it's on the Fireside Reading channel on YouTube. Until I see you next, please be very well. Good night.